During the 1970s and 1980s, Miami was the epicenter of a horrific cocaine-fueled war. Several drug cartels, primarily the Medellín Cartel from Colombia, wreaked havoc on the streets of this city, now renowned as one of the most popular tourist destinations in the United States. To seize control of this extremely lucrative market, worth billions of dollars, drug traffickers were willing to do anything, including firing machine guns in broad daylight in crowded places at the risk of killing innocent victims. At that time, violence was rampant in the city of Miami, and the influx of narcotics, including marijuana and especially cocaine, increased dramatically. In fact, in the 1980s, Miami was known as the world capital of drugs. But how was this made possible? How did drug traffickers from South America proliferate in this region of the United States? In this video, we will try to answer that. To do so, let's embark on a journey to discover this dark chapter of American history, both violent and surreal. The Miami Drug War of the 1980s. A period made famous by cultural works such as the series Miami Vice, the film Scarface, and the video game Grand Theft Auto Vice City. The history of drugs in Miami and Florida more generally dates back well before the 1970s and 1980s. In fact, the people of this region have had to deal with persistent problems related to the transport of illegal goods. Indeed, due to its geographical location, Florida, and more precisely South Florida, has long been attractive in several respects. Straddling the Gulf of Mexico, the Atlantic Ocean, and the Strait of Florida, this state has been, over time, a strategic location for tourism, agriculture, or trade. Its coastline, the longest in the United States, has therefore always been an open door for smugglers who saw it as the perfect hub for their illegal businesses. The phenomenon in question dates back to the time of pirates and buccaneers, but in this video, we will limit our historical overview to the 20th century, starting with the 1920s. During the Roaring Twenties, to be more precise, on January 17, 1920, a new amendment came into force in the United States. The 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution, better known as Prohibition, was enacted in 1920 with the aim of prohibiting the manufacture, sale, and consumption of alcoholic beverages. This nationwide ban on alcohol lasted for over a decade, from 1920 to 1933. While the intent of Prohibition was to address the social and health problems associated with alcohol consumption, it had the unintended consequence of creating a thriving black market for alcohol. This led to the rise of organized crime, as bootleggers, smugglers who illegally transported and sold alcohol, profited from the high demand for prohibited goods. Florida, due to its geographical location and lax enforcement of prohibition laws, became a hub for bootlegging activities. The state's proximity to the Caribbean and its numerous waterways made it easy to transport alcohol from Cuba and the Bahamas into the United States. Additionally, Florida's corrupt politicians and law enforcement officials often turned a blind eye to bootlegging operations in exchange for bribes. This combination of factors made Florida a paradise for bootleggers and a haven for criminal activity. The state was notorious for its rampant gambling, prostitution, violence, and overall disregard for the law. Al Capone, one of the most infamous gangsters in American history, established himself in Miami during the late 1920s, further solidifying the city's reputation as a lawless haven. The end of Prohibition in 1933 brought an end to the illegal alcohol trade, but the legacy of this era continues to shape Florida's history and culture. The state's association with bootlegging, organized crime, and an anything-goes attitude has become an integral part of its identity. During the height of Prohibition, Miami transformed into a lawless haven, where illicit liquor flowed freely and speakeasies thrived. Bootleggers, the daring individuals who defied the alcohol ban, reveled in their illicit trade, flaunting their contraband with reckless abandon. The city pulsed with an intoxicating energy, earning it the moniker of the Wild West of the East Coast. Smugglers capitalized on Miami's strategic location, utilizing its proximity to the Caribbean to transport vast quantities of rum into the thirsty nation. The city's waterways and porous borders provided ample opportunities for these enterprising outlaws to bypass the authorities and deliver their prized cargo to eager customers. However, this illicit trade came at a steep price. Violent clashes between rival gangs, corrupt law enforcement officials, and determined prohibition agents became a grim reality of life in Miami. The city's streets echoed with the sounds of gunfire as these factions vied for control of the lucrative liquor market. One particularly illustrative incident occurred in April 1932 when 5 prohibition agents attempted to raid an unsuspecting restaurant in Miami Beach, a notorious hotspot for illegal drinking. The raid quickly turned into a chaotic shootout, with the agents forced to barricade themselves inside the establishment and call for reinforcements. Meanwhile, the restaurant's patrons, far from cowering in fear, vented their frustration by slashing the agents' tires. This anecdote epitomizes the rampant lawlessness that characterized Prohibition-era Miami. The city had become a battleground between those seeking to enforce the ban and those determined to defy it, resulting in an era of unprecedented anarchy and debauchery. While Prohibition had a significant impact on the entire United States, no state embraced the illicit activities associated with it quite like Florida. The state's unique geographical position, coupled with a lax attitude towards law enforcement, created an environment ripe for criminal enterprises to flourish. Al Capone, one of the most notorious gangsters in American history, recognized the potential of Florida and established himself in Miami Beach in 1928. His presence further solidified the state's reputation as a haven for bootleggers and other criminals. Capone's influence extended beyond the alcohol trade, and he played a key role in shaping the criminal landscape of Florida. Following the repeal of Prohibition in 1933, Florida's criminal activities shifted towards gambling. Meyer Lansky, a prominent figure in organized crime, emerged as a major player in this new era. Lansky's expertise in managing and operating casinos made him a sought-after partner, and he established gambling establishments in various locations, including Los Angeles, the Bahamas, Cuba, and, of course, Florida. Lansky's operations in Florida proved to be lucrative, but the growing scrutiny from law enforcement eventually forced him to diversify his business interests. The increased surveillance made it too risky for him to rely solely on gambling, and he sought out other avenues for illicit profits. Florida's history with illicit activities, from the Prohibition era to the rise of gambling empires, is a testament to the state's unique position in the world of organized crime. Its geographical advantages and often lax enforcement have made it an attractive destination for criminals seeking to operate outside the law. After facing increased scrutiny from law enforcement in Florida, Meyer Lansky, a prominent figure in organized crime, expanded his business interests into other areas. He ventured into horse racing and sports betting, maintaining his base of operations in Florida. Lansky's ambitions extended beyond Florida, and in the late 1940s, he crossed the Gulf of Mexico to Cuba. There he found a welcoming ally in Fulgencio Batista, the then president of Cuba. Batista's regime provided a favorable environment for Lansky's illicit activities, and he established a strong presence on the island. Lansky's success in Cuba attracted other mafia bosses from the northern United States, who sought to capitalize on the island's potential for lucrative criminal enterprises. The allure of Cuba's tropical climate and its proximity to the United States made it an attractive destination for these organized crime figures. This trend of mafia expansion continued into the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, a period marked by the rise of the Italian-American mafia, particularly in New York City with the infamous 5 families: Bonanno, Colombo, Gambino, Genovese, and Lucchese. During the 1970s, New York City gained notoriety as the most violent city in the United States. The 5 families held the city in their grip, instilling fear and chaos among its residents. However, their reign of terror came to an end in the following decade as law enforcement efforts led to their dismantling. New York City began to recover from the grip of organized crime, gradually regaining a sense of peace and stability. Before the 1970s and the onset of the drug trade, Miami was a tranquil city with a modest economy. The towering skyscrapers that now define its skyline were yet to be built, and the downtown area lacked the vibrancy that characterizes it today. The population was largely comprised of retirees seeking a peaceful haven in the city's warm climate. However, a significant event in 1975 marked a turning point for Miami. A large community of Cuban exiles had settled in the city and its surroundings, fleeing the political turmoil and failed Bay of Pigs invasion in the early 1960s. Many of these exiles found success in the fishing industry, particularly in harvesting lobster from Bahamian waters. In 1975, a major disruption occurred when Bahamian authorities abruptly banned Cuban fishermen from operating in their waters. This sudden restriction had devastating consequences for the Cuban fishermen, who relied heavily on lobster for their livelihoods. Overnight, they found themselves without a source of income and facing an uncertain future. The abrupt loss of their livelihood due to the Bahamian fishing ban in 1975 forced many Cuban exiles in Miami to seek alternative means of survival. Desperate times called for desperate measures, and some turned to the illicit world of drug trafficking. Capitalizing on their expertise in navigating the waters, these Cuban fishermen transformed their fishing boats into vessels for transporting marijuana from Latin America to the shores of South Florida. The operation was relatively simple yet effective. 1. Load the marijuana onto their high-speed fishing boats. 2. Transport the cargo to the U.S. coast, specifically South Florida. 3. Offload the marijuana. 4. Collect their payment and disappear without a trace. The lack of stringent coastal controls in Florida made it a smuggler's paradise, allowing them to enter the United States with relative ease. However, when authorities did manage to intercept these illicit shipments, the quantities seized were staggering. Some hauls involved boats carrying up to 40 tons of marijuana. As the influx of marijuana into Miami intensified, the market became saturated, leading to a sharp decline in prices. This situation prompted the enterprising traffickers to seek out a more lucrative commodity, cocaine. Initially, cocaine was transported in small quantities, most often in suitcases. This drug, far more expensive than marijuana, was the one that would trigger the drug war in Miami. This is the 1970s, and local authorities are now faced with two types of trafficking. Marijuana first, which they often manage to seize in large quantities, and cocaine, more difficult to get their hands on. Cocaine came mainly from Colombia, more precisely from Medellin, where several drug cartels were established. Among them were, of course, Pablo Escobar's, but also that of Fabio Ochoa Restrepo, a cocaine trafficker considered at this time as one of the most powerful in the world. A kind of godfather of the cocaine trade, in short. Initially, it was organized Cuban crime that managed the cocaine market in Miami. The Cubans, in fact, played the role of intermediary between Colombia, where coke arrived in blocks, and the United States. They were thus in contact with the Medellín cartels and smuggled dope into American soil. Among the Cuban smugglers who facilitated the cocaine trade in Miami were notable figures like the Falcon brothers and Sal Magluta. These individuals oversaw the transport of an estimated $2 billion worth of cocaine from Colombia. However, the Colombians were not merely the producers of this drug that would transform Miami's landscape in the 1980s. Many of them, like the Cubans, were also involved in the distribution. As they operated, they realized that they were relinquishing a significant portion of their profits to intermediaries who were not essential to their operations. These intermediaries, of course, were the Cubans, whom the Colombians eventually sought to replace. This realization paved the way for the emergence of Colombian narco-traffickers in Miami towards the end of the 1970s. One of the most influential among them was Rafael Cardona Salazar, known by his alias Rafa. Along with his friend and associate Max Mermelstein, an American-born trafficker, they both engaged in drug trafficking in Miami on behalf of the Colombian cartels. Rafa was considered a key member of the Medellin Cartel. During his career as a drug trafficker, that is in the 1970s and 1980s, he is said to have been responsible for refining and shipping most of the cocaine consumed in the United States. Every kilo of coke that arrived on U.S. soil was controlled by Rafa. Max Mermelstein worked for him. The two were, as said, very good friends. Together, they collaborated with Colombian drug traffickers to transport cocaine in bulk to the United States. Among their business partners were, of course, Pablo Escobar, the Ochoa brothers, Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha, or Carlos Leda. From then on, the cocaine was no longer transported in simple suitcases, but arrived either by plane or by boat. The more the quantities increased, the more the American authorities were overwhelmed. At the beginning of the activity, the cocaine packages contained only 1 or 2 kilos. Then they quickly rose to 1 ton until they reached 10 tons. Medellin coke was thus smuggled into Miami before spreading throughout the eastern United States. From then on, millions of Americans began to consume this illicit drug. Cocaine was in vogue, and demand became insatiable. By the late 1970s, 5 million people were snorting, shooting up, or smoking coke each month. As a result of this huge influx of drugs, Miami's economy skyrocketed. All of the dirty money generated by cocaine trafficking was, in fact, laundered by the narcos into legitimate businesses, such as jewelry stores or nightclubs. It was estimated that $80 billion was passing through Miami's underground economy annually at this time. Miami's nightlife also experienced a real boom. Drug trafficking nightclubs were well established, and drug traffickers took the opportunity to flaunt their Rolexes, diamond rings, and exorbitantly priced bottles of alcohol. The narcos were getting rich and could sometimes have $50,000 or even $100,000 in their pockets. One of these clubs, the most popular at the time, was Mutiny. Nicknamed Scarface Hotel, the Mutiny was a haven for drug traffickers, who typically met there to conduct business. The Mutiny was a hotbed of crime, but that didn't stop celebrities from visiting, including musician Rick James, Miami Vice actor Philip Michael Thomas, and Miami Dolphins players. In fact, the Babylon Hotel in the movie Scarface was inspired by the Mutiny. Thanks to the cocaine trade, the drug traffickers became immensely wealthy. This allowed them to buy countless luxury goods, including cars, Rolexes, villas, and countless real estate. Of course, all of this was made possible through the corruption of the police and the judicial system. Yes, bribes were common during this period. Police officers, lawyers, judges, the majority of them were corrupt. Then a tragedy struck that would plunge Miami into the most extreme violence. 1979 was the year that turned Miami into another criminal dimension. In addition to drug trafficking, the city now had to deal with another type of crime: murder. Indeed, in the late 1970s, Miami saw its homicide rate increase drastically. Multiple bodies, mostly young Hispanics, were found by police in the municipality and its surroundings. These murders, closely linked to drug trafficking, would then be the starting point for a terrible war between the narcos of the different cartels. It all started on July 11, 1979, at the Dadeland Mall in Miami. That afternoon, 2 men from the Colombian cartel, armed with machine guns, shot and killed another drug trafficker and his bodyguard in a liquor store in broad daylight. During the shooting, a total of 60 bullets were fired, also injuring 2 people. This event, known as the Dadeland Mall Massacre, marked the beginning of a bloody war between the Medellin Cartel, led by Pablo Escobar, and the Cali Cartel. The 2 cartels would fight for control of the cocaine trade in Miami, and the city would become a battleground. The Dadeland Mall Massacre was a shocking event that sent shockwaves through Miami. It made it clear that the cocaine trade was not a game, and that the violence associated with it was out of control. The massacre also led to a crackdown on drug trafficking by law enforcement, which further fueled the violence between the cartels. The war between the Medellin and Cali cartels would last for years and would claim the lives of thousands of people. It would make Miami one of the most dangerous cities in the world. As the assassins fled, they sprayed bullets at all the passers-by in the vicinity. A few hours later, less than a kilometer from the crime scene, their vehicle was finally found by the police, who were left speechless. The criminals had left behind a veritable war chariot, an armored steel van equipped with gun ports, heavy weapons, bulletproof vests, and ammunition. Upon discovering this arsenal, the police forces realized that Miami was entering a new world. The drug traffickers were far better armed than the Miami Metropolitan Police and were beginning to make the city their playground. Following this horrific incident, the Miami police officers nicknamed the city's narcos the Cocaine Cowboys. This event marked a turning point in Miami's history. It signaled the beginning of an era of unprecedented violence and corruption fueled by the cocaine trade. The city would become known as the cocaine capital of the world and would be plagued by drug-related crime for years to come. The Dadeland Mall Massacre was a shocking event that sent shockwaves through Miami. It made it clear that the cocaine trade was not a game and that the violence associated with it was out of control. The massacre also led to a crackdown on drug trafficking by law enforcement, which further fueled the violence between the cartels. A cocaine cowboy was a Colombian national living illegally in South Florida who was either there to smuggle drugs or to settle a score. The Dadeland Mall Massacre, which received national media coverage, marked the beginning of the drug war in South Florida. Mafia-style executions intensified in the region, and the police, completely overwhelmed by the situation, were unfortunately unable to do anything. Outnumbered by the narcos, they were seriously struggling to contain the cataclysm that was befalling the city. As the Medellin Cartel consolidated its control over the drug trade in the region, the pace of killings accelerated. Cocaine was a violent business because it was very profitable. In fact, all it took was for one drug dealer to suspect another of ripping him off for the story to end in a bloodbath. Given the profits, which were typically in the millions of dollars, it was easy enough for the gangsters to pull the trigger. This is why the number of homicides exploded in Miami in the 1980s. The rivalries between the cartels were in a way the trigger for the war. By the way, one cartel dominated the market more than the others, and the latter was not led by a man, but by a woman. Griselda Blanco. Griselda Blanco was one of the pioneers of cocaine trafficking. Raised in the slums of Medellin, she began her criminal career as a pickpocket and bank robber before moving into drug trafficking and rising to the top of the underworld. She was one of the main leaders of the cocaine trade in Miami in the 1980s. Blanco worked closely with the Colombian cartel to transport the white powder illegally to the United States. And thanks to her, an impressive volume of drugs circulated on American soil, allowing Pablo Escobar, among others, to develop his trafficking in the USA. Griselda Blanco was therefore the main architect of the cocaine trade between South America and Miami. Her arrival in Florida was indeed the catalyst for the drug war. The one who was nicknamed the godmother of cocaine was in fact responsible for more than 250 murders. Yes, for Blanco, money was more important than loyalty. From then on, she had no problem ordering assassinations to consolidate her grip on Miami. Blanco was a psychopath. She could kill her partner as well as her husband. The first homicide she was involved in was the Dadeland Mall Massacre in July 1979, the trigger for the drug war. Then many others followed. Many of these assassinations involved shooting in crowded places in broad daylight. No one was safe from the bullets that flew during these scores. Even children were caught in the crossfire. In fact, her hitmen and cartel enforcers in general didn't care much about innocent victims. At this time, Griselda Blanco invented a new type of execution, the motorcycle assassination, a style of murder that involved passing by his victims, showering them with bullets and fleeing at full speed on a motorcycle to avoid traffic. For the police, the situation was therefore becoming very complicated. All the more so since the criminals used an incalculable number of false identities and aliases. This made the task more difficult, especially to find those responsible for the murders. Sometimes police inspectors couldn't even identify the victims, as most were undocumented. Then came the Mariel Exodus, the most spectacular influx of migrants in American history, which brought thousands of Cuban criminals to the shores of Florida. In 1980, Fidel Castro decided to get rid of his country's undesirables. Counter-revolutionaries, gangsters, killers, rapists, child molesters, you name it. From then on, many Cuban prisoners found themselves free on the streets of Miami. In addition to the drug traffickers, the city therefore had to face a new problem: the arrival of Cuba's most ruthless criminals. Yeah, the situation was only getting worse. After the Mariel exodus in 1980, Miami's homicide rate doubled and the crime rate increased by 89%. The city recorded over 560 homicides and became, by the same token, the national murder capital. The more time passed, the more bodies piled up in the morgues. Overwhelmed, the authorities were forced to rent refrigerated trailers to store the surplus of bodies. For many, the situation was therefore becoming unbearable. First of all, for the police, completely overwhelmed by events, because in addition to being understaffed, they did not have heavy weapons, unlike the narcos, and were sorely lacking in financial means to counterattack. And of course, the civilians, who unfortunately suffered the collateral damage of these scores between drug traffickers. Some Miami residents then began to arm themselves and fight back. Then there came a time when civilians were killing as many criminals as the police. The world was standing on its head. From then on, the mere fact of circulating in the streets of Miami became dangerous, and no one seemed to have the solution to counter this scourge. Until the day the government started to get involved. The incessant murders perpetrated by the narcos in the streets of Miami transformed the city into a real battlefield. Miami's image deteriorated day by day. Tourism, on the other hand, drastically decreased, and the media strongly criticized the chaotic situation in the region. However, a glimmer of hope was born when a special unit called CENTAC 26 Inches was created. CENTAC was a joint operation between the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, the Metropolitan Homicide Brigade, and the organized crime units. Its objective? To get rid of the criminals responsible for the wave of homicides that has been hitting Miami since the late 1970s, Griselda Blanco being the #1 target. More generally, it is trained to fight the narco-trafficking gangrene in the streets of the city. To do this, CENTAC agents first equipped themselves better than the narcos. Usually, cartel killers always had the upper hand over the police during armed confrontations. Their favorite weapon, the MAC-10, a submachine gun that could fire 16 bullets per second, far surpassed the law enforcement's shotguns. They also had better vehicles and were more numerous. Their favorite weapon, the MAC-10, a submachine gun that could fire up to 16 bullets per second, far surpassed the simple pistols of the law enforcement. To correct this, CENTAC therefore decided to equip themselves not with submachine guns, but with machine guns. From then on, it was easier for them to fight against drug traffickers. The proof, thanks to CENTAC's interventions, many narcos were arrested. Griselda Blanco, for her part, began to lose a lot of men. Then the government got involved and the cocaine godmother's empire crumbled like a house of cards. Indeed, Blanco's barbaric acts finally attracted the attention of the federal authorities and the U.S. government. Ronald Reagan, the U.S. president himself, then recognized the serious drug problem in Miami, a finding made in 1982 following the seizure of an amount of cocaine equivalent to $100 million at the city's airport. In the wake of this huge seizure, a task force called the South Florida Drug Task Force was therefore created. Headed by Vice President George Bush, its goal was to analyze the problems and determine the measures to be taken to combat crime in South Florida. From then on, the situation changed very quickly in Miami. At this time, everyone was fed up, whether it was the city's residents or the government. The situation was becoming critical, and it was imperative to fight against the scourge of drugs. As a result, the government authorities decided to go all out, bringing the cavalry to Miami. Task forces came in reinforcements. State troops began patrolling the city streets. The Navy loaned 2 of its radar planes to fight drug trafficking, and the Army allocated some of its combat helicopters. Suffice to say that the situation was becoming tense for the drug traffickers. This is what prompted Griselda Blanco, the godmother of cocaine, to leave for California in 1984. When she left, the homicide rate and coke trafficking plummeted in Miami. In fact, the traffic had shifted to Los Angeles, where the narcos had established their new HQ. From then on, South Florida began to regain its calm. All the big names involved in drug trafficking in Miami were arrested one after the other, such as Max Mermelstein, who would later become an informant for the government. George Rivi Ayala, a formidable hitman working for Griselda Blanco. Mickey Monday, an American smuggler who's responsible for transporting over 38 tons of cocaine from Colombia to the United States. John Roberts, another notorious American drug trafficker who distributed over $2 billion worth of cocaine for the Medellín Cartel. He would also become an informant. And finally, Griselda Blanco, Miami's most prominent drug baron in the 1980s. Indeed, Blanco was arrested at her Los Angeles residence on February 18, 1985. She remained in prison until 2004, then was deported from the United States to Colombia, her native country. There, in 2012, irony of fate would have it that she was killed by a motorcycle assassin, the mode of execution she was originally from. The Miami drug war thus ended after her arrest in 1985. South Florida was finally rid of the violence and drug trafficking vermin. Miami now had to rebuild itself. After this era of violence, Miami found a more peaceful way of life. The city actually managed to heal its international image and attract tourists again. All the businesses, once owned by the narcos to launder their dirty money, ended up going bankrupt and closing down one after the other, such as nightclubs, car dealerships, or jewelry stores. This created new opportunities for investors, and Miami's economy took off again. In the end, it can be said that the drug trade saved Miami in many ways. The billions of dollars generated by cocaine have indeed fueled the development of many infrastructures. And the skyscrapers, which today make the beauty of the city, are the perfect example. Towards the end of the 1980s, Miami thus became more glamorous and exotic. The city was once again a prime destination for tourists, and everything eventually fell into place over time. Well, at least in appearance, because drug trafficking was still present in the region. Certainly the violence had drastically decreased, but the cocaine was still circulating. That's all for this video. Thank you for watching it to the end. The drug war in Miami was a dark chapter in the city's history, but it is also an important part of its past. It is a reminder of the dangers of drug trafficking and the devastating impact it can have on communities. Miami has come a long way since the dark days of the 1980s. The city is now a vibrant and cosmopolitan city with a lot to offer its residents and visitors. I hope this video has given you a better understanding of the drug war in Miami. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. Thank you for watching.